Hello, I'm Imara Jones, host of The Last Sip on Free Speech TV, but today I am joining you from the Bioneers Conference in San Rafael, California, to learn about what the planet can teach us about saving ourselves and it at the same time. And I'm thrilled to be joined right now by Kenny Ausubel, who is the co-founder of Bioneers many years ago and an award winner in many different ways, a documentary filmmaker, a leading thinker. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure. I love Free Speech TV.
I really appreciate it.
I enjoy you.
Thank you. Thank you. So first off, we'll start. I just wanted to get a sense of how, after so many years of doing Bioneers and co-founding it with Nina, where you think the conference is in terms of shifting our understanding and consciousness around ourselves and the planet.
Well, it's more than a conference to me. I mean, it's a movement, you know, and in 1990, this started as an almost offhand thing. There was certainly no plan behind it. And at that time, you know, forget being a blip on the radar screen. I mean, we might as well have been a UFO, you know. And 29 years later, this is a mass movement, and the culture, in my opinion, has shifted radically. And that's part of why we're seeing this degree of resistance from the plutocracy and from the patriarchy and all that other fun stuff. I think they're seriously threatened, and they recognize that their power is being seriously challenged. And there are huge demographic shifts occurring, cultural shifts occurring that are not going backwards. You know, it's just not going to turn around again. And so they're having to resort more and more to force, you know, to actually retain their power in that way. But I think at the same time, what I've witnessed is the massive growth of this movement of movements across the board. You know, when we, at our origins, one of the cornerstones was around biomimicry before the field even had a name. And now that's a huge movement. And as Jay Harmon talked about at the conference this morning, there's 164 biomimicry institutes in China as of today. I mean, you know, which is very interesting because they're, of course, a Taoist country with a profound reverence for nature. So culturally, it was a natural that might arise there in such a big way. But, you know, Indigenous wisdom was another pillar of Bioneers from the very, very beginning. For years and years, people, why do you have the Indians there? You know, I mean, what is this about? You know, and here after Standing Rock last year, I mean, this is now a national awareness in a very, very different way, especially among younger people, I think. So we're seeing really tectonic shifts occurring now. And as I say, that's why I think, you know, as I quoted Michelle Alexander this morning, we're not the resistance. A new nation is being born. Trump is the one who's fighting it.
Right, and so as you're saying, I mean, I think that's what you offer is a really important perspective, because many people feel as if that it's the opposite, right? That we're going backwards and we're sliding and we're losing, et cetera, et cetera. But as you're pointing out, the reason why the fight back is so strong is because the country had shifted in a very different way. I mean, even if I think about just how many corporations, for example, who are part of the problem, but in this case, how many, I think over 200 of them, once the United States said we're pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, said, well, we're not. We're going to stick to the exact same goals and the timetables, and really lobbied against going backwards. So I think this is a really important thing for people to hear.
Yeah, and I mean, just that's a good example that you're raising here, because by the early 2020s, renewables across the board are going to be more competitive than the petroleum industry. That's it. They're going to have something like $250 billion, or no, $36 trillion in stranded assets. They know this is coming. That's why all the deregulation is going on right now. They're already setting it up for the government to do a fossil fuel bailout. You know, capitalism is supposed to be creative destruction, you know, may the best company win, you know, whatever, and if you become archaic, you're out of the game. Well, that's not really how it works. I mean, the only creative destruction is they destroy any competition.
Right.
You know, so I think that that's the kind of massive shift that is underway now, and big business, you know, many companies see this, and they have to be reality-based.
Right.
I mean, if they're going to survive, they have to be clear-eyed at least about what, you know, the existential conditions are. So I think we're seeing one after another shift at that scale, and you know, there's just no way around that. So that's why the desperation.
Before we talk about a lot of the way in which you use communications to get the word out and to help shift this personally and in other ways. Can you talk a little bit about why you think, from your perspective, this the idea of the resistance to any type of movement on climate change, any type of respect for the planet, any type of respect for the species that are on the planet is so essential to their idea of turning the clock back in America? What is it about this obsession with ownership and exploitation of natural resources that's so endemic to them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really complex philosophical question on one level. On another level, it's a political question. But I think, if you go back 500 years to Copernicus, that was really the birth of the scientific revolution, which replaced faith with reason, which in many ways was very liberating for humanity, rather than the oppression of what I call BS belief systems,
Right.
That suddenly you could actually be rational and reasonable and think through things, and it gave you a sense of agency, rather of being an individual with choice rather than having a doctrine imposed upon you. But what it also led to is the materialist worldview, that everything is, ultimately just a thing, an object, that only human consciousness exists. Everything else is an inert, dumb machine, basically, the clock model of the universe. And what that's led to is the commodification of everything and the objectification of everything. And that also applies to people, of othering in the full sense of that. And at the same time, that was also, 1492, the quote, age of discovery of Columbus, and, the conquest and the real full birth of globalization as we know it. And that led to an economic system, the fall of feudalism and monarchies essentially, and the birth of the merchant class and ultimately the capitalist model, which for 500 years has been concentrating wealth and distributing poverty. So I think that's the political piece of it. And they're going to hold on no matter what. I mean, no, Google is not ExxonMobil, but at the same time, they are a mega corporation. Apple just did $1 trillion, Amazon just did $1 trillion. These are nation states. These are they're more powerful than most countries in the world. So that kind of power and wealth concentration is just a bad formula for, a living system in an interdependent world. It's not a viable, it's what I call make feudalism great again, basically. So I think it's complex, but there is a philosophical mentality, and I think that's a lot of what Bioneers is about, is the idea that, we had Monica Gagliano, the plant scientist, speak yesterday about plant cognition, and that, plants may not have a brain, but they act like a brain. Their entire organism, where they have rhodopsin throughout their bodies as plants, and that's what we have in our eyes. That's what actually allows us to see. Well, plants have it all over their body, so they actually can tell what kind of dress you're wearing, or if your hair is black or white, or anything else. So, I think that awareness, that certainly that understanding, is becoming very widespread today. That we're not the only intelligence. In fact, we're lucky to be part of this much larger, incredible genius around us. That's a great mystery that we frankly barely understand.
Right. The entire planet is a networked intelligence, right?
That's
that
right.
We're a part of. One of the interesting things just on this point about the concentration and the imbalances that it creates is that on the principles of biomimicry, which are at the heart of what Bioneers is all about, is this idea that anything in nature that becomes concentrated and imbalanced is ultimately not sustainable, right?
That's
You
right.
can't concentrate anything to such a large degree and have it have longevity.
No, that's exactly right. Nature is highly decentralized, and it's a fail-safe mechanism against extinction, that if one part of a system fails, the entire system doesn't collapse. And I think the work of Gar Alperowitz and the Democracy Collaborative, Gar spoke here today, he's talking about a much more decentralized economy that's built from the bottom up by relocalizing economies. He mentioned this one city, small city in England called Preston, which is about 140,000 people. And they bet their entire wad in 2012 on a big company coming in and building a giant mall and all the rest of it. And the company ended up pulling out, and the city was bankrupt. 140,000 people out on the street, basically. And somebody compared it to a sort of Dickensian scenario of private wealth and public squalor. You know, they couldn't fix their roads. They closed down. There's huge addiction problems now because of the poverty and depression, and they closed down all the drug treatment and alcohol treatment centers. So what did they do? So they adopted the model that GAR has been promoting here in the US of this idea of anchor institutions that are generally EDs and MEDs, educational institutions and medical institutions, healthcare, that are rooted in community and have very large purchasing budgets. But they're not going to move, they're part of the community, building the community. And so they actually started to use their procurement dollars to build local businesses. And they built local businesses that are worker-owned, that are cooperatives, that are publicly owned. It's an entirely different model. So in that localized economy, about 63 pence out of a pound is now spent locally, as opposed to less than 40 cents in a corporate economy that existed before that. That's the difference. I mean, that's huge.
Right.
It's a 50% increase in local spending. So that kind of decentralization, I mean, the economy is behind so much of this. You know, they say it's the economy stupid, but it's actually the stupid economy. And it's kind of a big duh to change it. And that's happening much more widely than people realize right now.
Right, and the same is true for energy production. I mean, one of the reasons why fossil fuel companies fight renewables is that it's actually a way to decentralize energy production, right? And to create these redundant systems of energy production that aren't reliant upon, you know, one system. And it's as you sort of imply, it's a smart way to do it, but our economies don't provide for these flexibilities.
No, exactly. They fight this tooth and nail. And I mean, the Austin Power Company is a very good example in Austin, Texas, excuse me, that is publicly owned. It's owned by the city. And over the last decade, they've put $500 million into the community, into Austin. I mean, that's a lot of dough.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it's much better service, and it's 100, or I don't know if it's 100% renewables, but it's predominantly renewables now. So, I mean, what's to to decide here? It's a pretty easy decision.
Right. I mean, what's interesting is your message today is really hopeful at a time when a lot of people aren't hopeful. And a part of that hope is giving kind of what you're doing here, which are alternative visions, new stories, new narratives that allow people to see and underscore what the possibilities are. It's kind of at the heart of what you have done through film. And I know that now you're working on a 10-part television series, and I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about that.
So it's actually based on a book called Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, by a cultural historian and scholar named Richard Tarnas, based here in the Bay Area. He's a cultural historian. He wrote a very famous book called The Passion of the Western Mind, that's an archetypal analysis of Western civilization that's not at all a hit job. It's very fair and balanced, as they say. But his deeper interest is actually in astrology. And, you know, this has been dismissed as, you know, New Age, airy-fairy nonsense and all the rest of it. I've been personally interested in astrology for a long time, just as a hobby, whatever. But what Rick did is he documented across history, going back many, many centuries, that each time certain planets align in a particular configuration, on Earth, simultaneously, a zeitgeist will arise worldwide, you know, everywhere, that corresponds to the archetypes traditionally associated by astrologers with those planets. Well, the one that we're in now, the dominant one, because there's always, you know, more than one thing going on, is Uranus and Pluto, which represent archetypally revolution and large-scale social transformation, creative destruction. Excuse me. And so that's from 2007 through 2020. The last time it happened was 1960 to 1972, the 60s. And if you go back throughout history, it was in the 1930s, at the turn of the century, the French Revolution, the middle of the 19th century, Karl Marx, revolutions all over Europe. So it clocks with every period of major disruption, breakdown, breakthrough, upheaval, political revolutions, both left and right, and upheavals, quantum leaps, game-changing paradigm shifts across every field of human endeavor.
Wow.
And so I thought that that would be an extremely interesting lens through which to look at this current time, and backcast to look across history at the trajectory of these social movements to see, you know, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It turns out that was actually said first by Theodore Parker, an abolitionist, during Uranus-Pluto transit in the mid-19th century, right? The larger takeaway is what's most interesting, which is that if you entertain the premise for a moment that, say, Uranus and Pluto do this dance, and each time there's an archetypally predictable zeitgeist that will arise, that suggests that consciousness supersedes human consciousness and is pervasive throughout nature and throughout the cosmos itself.
That's right.
It's a great mystery. Nobody has an answer to this, and that's part of the point, is how little we know. But so that's really what the film looks like. And the other, I think, very important takeaway is that archetypes are multivalent. They're light and shadow and everything in between. And so these, if you're aware that these forces, these much larger forces are at work, you have much more freedom to be able to work with it and to choose how you want to respond, rather than sort of being a pawn, just driven by the winds of fate in that regard. In other words, we have a tremendous amount of agency, and I think we all contain the light and the dark within us, and we always have a choice every moment of every day how we express that. We can be an angel or a devil or a saint or a sinner, or however you want to characterize it. But I think that's the moment that we're at, is that moment of really understanding we have a choice how we want to respond to these forces, So that's what it's about. It's called Changing of the Gods.
That's a great title. And within the connection of the events that you just mentioned over the past couple of 100 years, the period after the upheaval looks like what?
Well, the solar system is a dynamic mobile unit, right? So it's not like it's a clockwork thing. Everything is always changing, and the cycles can, some of the planets are elliptical and move at different speeds. What we're going through right now, both at the beginning and the end of this current transit, 2007, 8, 9, and 2018 through 2020, a third important planet has come into the picture, which is Saturn. And Saturn is, again, has light and shadow, but it is structure, it is form, it is systems in that way. It is the teacher, the wise elder, the mentor. On the dark side, it's the patriarchy, it's repression, it's the chickens coming home to roost, it's the reality principle. Whatever you haven't cleaned out in your attic is going to come back. And so it's also it's contraction. Jupiter is expansion, Saturn is contraction. So it's associated with economic contractions. Well, sure enough, 2008, 9, the financial crisis, right? It's beginning right now. We're going to see another one. That would be like, I'll hang my ass out of the line and make a prediction.
Sure.
We're going to see another recession, right? Or major economic contraction. The potential of alternatives is we can change the system, which is what I talked about this morning. This is the time to actually change the systems. On the other hand, the systems can change us.
Right.
Right? I mean, we can continue to be repressed, to have the patriarchy, seeking its death throes here, all of those factors. So, and then, however, on the more hopeful side, because this is going to be tough. We're going through the keyhole here these next several years. There's going to be a lot of breakdown, even more, a lot more repression, a lot more displacement at large. At the same time, after that, if we're not a smoking ruin,
if we survive.
Yeah. The Uranus-Pluto thing moves into a configuration of ease, and we're going to see everything we're working on now open up into a huge flow. So 2021, 2022, that's where we should see that start to really break.
Mm-hmm.
But
Great.
Between now and then, it's tough
going to
sledding.
be a rough ride.
Yeah.
But overall, though, you are, it seems hopeful, and in some ways maybe more hopeful than since the 1960s. Is that right?
Yeah, I am. And at the same time, I mean, the trauma is almost unbearable. Yeah. We're all living with it. The suffering that we're witnessing, and we're relatively very privileged here, but even here, but it's around the world. I mean, the suffering is just inconceivable.
It's true.
The vileness and the kind of depravity of the dark force right now is really, I mean, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by that, emotionally, psycho-spiritually. And I think that, healing is so important, and, there's been a lot of talk about it, but I feel like people are really needing to be kind to each other right now, to be really good at listening, and empathy is what we most need of anything in the world in many ways right now. So I think that we're, being pushed to our limits and then some. And so it's a very hard time, and in many ways it is the dark ages here. I believe it's the last gasp of all this, and that, there's, Noam Chomsky talks about the democracy deficit. When you look at actual public policies versus what the vast majority of people want, they're just totally different. we're having policies imposed on us that the huge majority of people don't want. Look at the last election. How can this guy win the popular vote and be the president? I mean, what is this? You know, so I think that that's part of the disconnect, is the power structure does not reflect what who the majority of us are and what we want. And for me, the other really just incredibly hopeful thing right now is the younger people and millennials and Gen Xers. And as I mentioned this morning, but 60 to 80% of them are overwhelmingly, I mean, every issue, you know, overwhelmingly positive. Climate action, same-sex marriage, you know, racial prejudice. I mean, just across the board, the young people so get it. Gender fluidity, gay marriage. Gay marriage, what's the problem? You know, I mean, it's just like a non-starter. And that's a huge cultural shift. And, you know, in many ways, we're still living out, or some of the older, you know, old white guys right now are still living out the culture wars of the 60s. As I said this morning, it's like, you know, the Japanese soldiers at the very end of World War II on an island who didn't know the war was over.
Right.
I mean, hello? So that's this moment, this cusp that we're at right now. And there's no guarantees. I mean, all this comes back to movement building. And the one good thing about Trump, and maybe the reason on some level this had to happen, was that he has galvanized everybody. I mean, he's offended everybody, offended the most fundamental human sensibilities, you know, and boy, he's got a lot of people not happy. And ready to do something,
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
Well, the hope is in Trump's, as you say, depravity. That's an interesting way to end. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your vision, your leadership, your storytelling ability. I think that the vision that you had, even if there was no plan behind it, there certainly was intentionality behind it that has led to this really, really important gathering, as you say, which is more than just this singular event. So thank you so much.
Oh, hey, pleasure. I love Free Speech TV. Love talking with you. Yeah. What we don't want is attention deficit disorder.
No,
so, right?
No, that's bad for where we are. As you said, we have to be mindful and have empathy and all these other things require us to pay attention.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be back with more terrific conversations like the one we just had.
Once you get into a paradigm where you say that anything that can't be measured can't really exist, then you're in trouble.
Because if there's one fatal systems error in Western civilization, it's this idea that we are separate from nature, separate from cosmos, separate from each other. And that appears not only not to be true, but that consciousness, which we've restricted only to people, is in fact pervasive throughout the universe. My name is Kenny Ausubel, and I'm really excited to be here with you today and invite your engagement with an amazing new film that we're producing called Changing of the Gods, Planetary and Human Revolutions. And it's my great honor to work with my very dear friend.
I'm Louis Schwartzberg. I'm a director and filmmaker. And when Kenny told me about this project, I had to jump on board. This is the greatest story never told.
If we track the movements and configurations of planets Uranus and Pluto, which are the picture for revolutionary transformation, there appears to be a direct correspondence on Earth with large-scale shifts in human consciousness and collective behavior. The last time it happened was in the 1960s. Before that, at the turn of the last century, upheaval all over the world. Before that, the middle of the 19th century in Europe, China, Turkey, worldwide. And of course, before that, the French Revolution. What we're living through is a period, from my perspective, of breakdown and breakthrough, of revolutionary transformation where the old paradigm is dying and a new one is being born.
When the outer planets come into like a conjunction relative to the Earth, these coincide with entire cultural epochs, like sustained historical periods that have a quality, a zeitgeist, that perfectly reflects the archetypal quality that astrologers have concluded are connected to those particular planets.
When I learned that there was a correlation between human history and the movement of the planets, which is, undeniable, that really just blew my mind. And I thought, wow, this is something I got to learn more about.
I've been so thrilled to bring the quintessence of the Bioneers community, their wisdom, onto the screen here. These are the great wisdom keepers of our time.
I've been going into Bioneers for almost 10 years, and I've been so inspired by the thought leaders that Kenny brings on stage, and Kenny himself.
Louis and I met about 12 years ago at the Sundance Institute and knew right away that we were soul brothers and had to do something together someday. Louis is a real artist of film, and you are transported by these movies. Truly, your consciousness changes, and you'll never see the world the same after you've seen a movie by Louis Schwartzberg. It opens up the magic, the mystery, the wonder, the awe, the reverence, and the sheer gratitude of what this gift of life is.
My greatest teacher has been Mother Nature, because capturing these rhythms and patterns with the magic of cinematography, whether it's slow motion, time-lapse, micro, macro, we're going to go into all these worlds and reveal the patterns, because what is above is below. What is inside is outside. Everything from the microscopic cell to, the Milky Way. This conscious spirit is something we want to learn more about. It's a mystery, being involved in the mystery. I think Einstein said his definition of God was a sense of wonder. That's the journey we want to be on.